Dear friends, this the second part of the story of Hosdurga-Holalkere man-eater. We made a good job of the whole effort, so that the pan looked no more, from a fair distance, than a small hump in the ground. A further complication now arose as Mac was about to get in, when his wife insisted on sitting with him. We both did our best to dissuade her, but she was adamant, with the result that finally the man and I raised the pan at one end, allowed the McTavishes to creep in, and then rearranged the whole affair. Actually, I felt it was quite safe inside, the inverted pan providing a sort of armored turret. The bait was then tied, and before going off to the rock on which I was to lie, it was agreed that, in case of need, we were to signal each other by 3 sharp whistles. I ascended my rock by 5 p.m., settled myself comfortably, and lay prone to await events. I recollect that the stone was uncomfortably hot after having been exposed to direct sunlight throughout the day. There was no sound as the hours dragged by and the forest seemed empty of any form of life. Even the familiar nightjar, welcome at the moment, was absent. The silence was deep and complete, and the stars twinkled down on me in eerie stillness. I fell to thinking of poor Fred Todd, and of what had happened to him. Midnight passed, when suddenly I heard a clear whistle, twice repeated. It was the agreed signal from Mac, and wondering what had happened to ail him, I slid down from the rock, switched on the torch, and cautiously approached the place where he and his wife were stationed. I came upon them standing beside the buffalo bait, which was alive and untouched. To one side lay the pan that they had overturned in getting out, and this is what they told me. They had seen and heard nothing till about midnight, when Mrs. Mac, sitting directly behind her husband who was facing the buffalo, thought she heard a faint sigh or moan behind her. Glancing around slowly, and endeavoring to look through the space between the pan and the ground, she had at first noticed nothing. Then she observed what appeared to be a boulder, as big as a bathtub, just 6 feet away. Remembering that there had been no boulder there earlier in the evening, she had brought her head closer to the opening, and was horrified to see a tiger, lying on the ground on its belly, its forelegs stretched out in front, intently meeting her gaze. Stifling the gasp of surprised horror that almost escaped her, she endeavored, by vigorous nudging, to attract her husband's attention. From his position Mac had seen nothing, and it was almost impossible for him to turn around, for the hole, that had originally been dug for one person, was too small to allow for the movement of 2. Sensing by her continued nudges that something unusual was afoot, Mac had then made a determined effort to turn himself, with the result that the muzzle of his extended rifle contacted the edge of the pan with a slight metallic clang. There was a loud woof one and a thud, as the tiger jumped lightly over the contraption. Knowing that they had been discovered and that no purpose was likely to be served by remaining any longer, they then summoned me by the agreed signal. To remain longer was useless, so we decided to return to the bungalow at Hosdurga, leaving the bait where it was for the night, pending a decision on some other plan. Early next morning I dispatched a party of men to bring in the bait. They returned with astounding news that the animal had been killed and entirely devoured. Hastening to the spot, we found their story true. Practically nothing remained of our bait but its head and hooves. Close examination of the ground revealed that 2 tigers had partaken of the meal, in close proximity, moreover, to the overturned sugar-cane pan and tarpaulin sheet, lying in a heap nearby, both of which had failed to frighten the beasts away. The deduction to be drawn from this latest development was, therefore, that our man-eater was also a cattle-eater when opportunity offered. Alternatively, there was the possibility that 3 tigers were operating in the vicinity, a man-eater, and 2 cattle killers. For the following night we decided to work to the same plan, tying a fresh bait a quarter-mile further along the same track, and to plant the sugar-cane pan beside it as before, this time making the shallow hole large enough to accommodate both Mac and myself. Mrs. Mac very reluctantly consented to remain in the bungalow. The camouflaged tarpaulin was spread over the pan, under a layer of loose sand and rubble, with grass, thorns and small cut bushes, to give the whole a very realistic appearance of a small rise in the ground. Mac and I sat back to back, rifles ready, with Mac facing the bait. On this occasion we also provided for a slightly greater aperture to allow more shooting space, by by using larger stones at the 4 opposite ends of the pan. Mac and I sat thus throughout 3 nights in succession, but we saw and heard nothing. But about 10 o'clock on the 4th morning, while we were having a nap in the bungalow, news arrived that a man had been killed a mile from Holalkere, in the same date palm grove where we had shot the bear some days earlier, and almost at the same spot. Hastening there by car, we were both disgusted and annoyed to find that the relations of the latest victim had in the meantime removed his body for cremation, so that we lost the chance of sitting up over this human kill, to which the tiger might possibly have returned. We then procured another buffalo bait at Holalkere, and tied it within 50 yards of the place where the man had been killed. A convenient tree overlooked the road at this spot, and on this tree I erected a machan. As Mac was feeling a bit seedy, and was tired after his vigil of 4 consecutive nights, he decided to rest on that occasion and one sat up alone. Again nothing happened, and 6 a.m. found me trudging the mile towards Holalkere with mixed feelings of tiredness, disappointment and disgust. Arriving there, I sent men out to bring back the bait. They came running back in half an hour with the news that, as they were about to untie the animal, a tiger had growled in the jungle within a few yards of them. They had then rushed pell-mell back to Holalkere, leaving the buffalo where it was. Jumping into the car, we hastened to the spot and were truly surprised to find our bait still alive. This was very unexpected, as we were certain that the tiger, or tigers, would have killed the buffalo as soon as the fleeing men were out of sight. Taking a chance, I went up into the machan at once, instructing Mac to return to Holalkere. There was just a possibility, I felt, that the tiger might turn up. Nothing happened, and as at 8 p.m. I was feeling both hungry and sleepy, I then got down, untied the bait, and walked along with it to Holalkere. That night, we retied the bait at the same spot, and I sat up once again. Mac and his wife went to Hosdurga in the car, and sat up together under the sugar-cane pan, beside the bait we had left there, in the spot where he and I had sat for 3 consecutive nights. Again nothing happened, and by 6:30 a.m. they came along in the car from Hosdurga, picked me up, and proceeded to the bungalow at Holalkere, where we all went to sleep after lunch. At 4 p.m., we were awakened by a great hubbub. Restoring some order in the throng that had collected in the veranda, we came to learn that a company of 12 men had left Holalkere before noon to drive a herd of cattle to Hosdurga for market, intending to cover the intervening distance long before sunset. About 3 miles from Holalkere, one of the cattle had strayed from the main road for a short distance of perhaps 25 yards. A man who had gone to drive it back was attacked by a tiger that had evidently been flanking the party, and was in hiding in the very bushes that bordered the roadside. Being cut off from retreat to his friends on the road, he had rushed up a rock that happened to be nearby. The whole scene had occurred in full view of the party, all of whom stood huddled together in a bunch and failed to render help of any sort, so stricken were they with fear. The tiger had then sprung up the rock and fastened the claws of a forepaw in the man's thigh, attempting to pull him down. The man, continuing to scream for help, had clung with both hands to the branch of a tree that overhung the rock, to save himself from being dragged down. The first attack failed, and the tiger slipped backwards to earth, its claws practically peeling the skin from the man's thigh, till it hung like the skin of a partially stripped banana. Becoming infuriated, and no doubt urged on by the sight of human blood, the tiger then made a second attempt, this time fastening both its forepaws squarely in the body of the man and dragging him from his feeble hold. Once it got him down from the rock, it had seized him by the neck and bounded off into the forest. It was a matter of minutes to reach the spot by car. Evidence of the fresh tragedy was available in abundance, the bits of human skin and fingernails embedded in the broken branch testifying to the intensity of that last desperate hold. Spattered blood could be seen everywhere, and there was a distinct trail where the victim had been carried away. We followed this up in all haste, the trail leading downwards to a valley of dense jungle. It was past 5 p.m. and we had exactly an hour to find the body before dark. Soon we discovered the usual pieces of tattered clothing, then a dark pool of blood where the tiger had deposited his victim, only to go on downwards into the dark valley. Perhaps 6 furlongs had been covered in this way when we came upon a low outcrop of rock, interspersed with bushes. I was surprised to find that the tiger had not yet stopped to begin its meal, as this was a quiet and secluded spot, but hardly had the thought entered my mind, when a distinct growl came from behind a large rock, followed by the sound of a small stone being dislodged, as the tiger bounded away before we could even see it. Rounding the bend, we encountered the corpse, weltering in its own blood, and about 1/3 devoured. Time was passing, there was no suitable tree nearby, and the only possible place to sit was on top of the largest of the neighboring rocks, which was about 12 feet high. This rock rose steeply on 3 sides, and was fairly safe against a tiger's spring, but unfortunately it sloped on the 4th side, and still more unfortunate was the fact that this sloping side did not face the dead man but was a little more than a right angle from the body's position. This meant that if I lay on top of the rock I would have to keep a careful watch in 2 directions, namely, on the corpse below me to the left, and on the sloping side of rock to my right, for fear that the tiger might make a sudden rush up this and beyond to me before I was aware of it. As I have said, I considered my rear, which faced one of the sides where the rock dropped steeply, fairly safe against a sudden spring, to do which the tiger would have to leap a clean 12 feet to the top of the rock. If he did not clear that height in one jump, he would have no hold at all and would slip backwards, which would give me ample time to shoot. No tiger, in my opinion, would risk such an uncertain jump. Screening the top of the rock on the sloping side with a few small stones and bushes, I scrambled up, after telling the Max to spend part of the night in driving up and down between Holalkere and Hosdurga in the hope of meeting the tiger on the road, in case it had abandoned the kill. With the departure of my friends and the villagers, I was now alone with the mangled remains that were strewn on the ground below me. The hours passed, while I kept an intent watch on the sloping rock to my right. The jungle beyond was hidden in darkness, and appeared just a blur in the hazy background, against which it was impossible to distinguish any animal smaller than an elephant. In the gloom the corpse to my left could no longer be seen. At about 10 o'clock a somber belled in the distant forest a mile away. This was followed by a tiger calling, which was answered shortly by another tiger in the direction of the road from which we had come. The complexity of the situation was now fully apparent, as I thought the matter over during those silent hours. We had at least 2 tigers operating in the area, possibly 3. Of these, one was a man-killer, daring, cruel and ruthless. The other was a cattle lifter, equally daring and cunning by nature. But this did not necessarily mean that either of the tigers refrained from indulging in both habits, when occasion presented. Again, there was the possibility of a 3rd tiger operating in the district, which might itself be a man-eater, or a cattle lifter, or both. So far, due to the dry weather and hard ground, we had been prevented from picking up any distinguishing pug marks to be able to identify these various animals. The tigers had ceased calling by now, and all was silent again in the surrounding forest except for the chirping of the tree crickets, the occasional hoot of an owl, and the periodic sound of a gust of wind bending the tops of the giant trees, a sound like the roar of a distant sea. Then suddenly, and without warning or premonition, it happened. There was a thud against the rock behind me, a violent scratching and scraping against the stone, mingled with a snarling growl, and then another thud as the tiger fell backwards to the ground. Before I could turn and peer over the edge of the rock, he was gone. That man-eater had done the unexpected thing. Having somehow become aware of my presence, he had stalked me from behind and attempted a sheer leap of 12 feet to the top of the rock where I was lying. By good fortune he had failed to make it by a few inches. I spent the rest of the night sitting up and fully alert, but nothing occurred. I waited till the sun had risen high next morning before venturing to scramble down and return to the road, as I feared the tiger, having discovered my presence, might be lying in ambush for me, but again my luck held out and I reached the road in safety, where Mac came for me in the car in a few minutes, having himself spent a fruitless night in driving up and down between Holalkere and Hosdurga. Immediately upon arrival at the bungalow I instructed a party of men to return to the human remains and cover them with branches to protect them against vultures, as I intended to sit up again on the rock that night. These men were just setting out, however, when the relatives of the dead man arrived from his village and demanded the remains for cremation. I attempted to persuade them to allow the body to stay where it was for another day. They were adamant, and so any opportunity that might have presented itself of avenging the death of that poor man that night was lost to us through the obstinacy of his relations.